Welcome back once again to Between Two FARS. Today, we are going to be talking about NASA's implementation of Section 3610 of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, known as the CARES Act. Now, the last two episodes, we have been so blessed to have veteran procurement attorney Michael Mark giving us the background for this episode. We've talked about the very basics of fiscal law that apply and how the FAR implements that fiscal law in our contracts. And now this is the real heart of the matter. How are we proceeding to implement the CARES Act in light of fiscal law and FAR responsibilities? Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you help tie all these ends together and give us some things that we really need to consider and think about as we move forward?
Well, I can try. This is a work in process, and so nothing has been written in stone yet. So what we're talking could change even by the time you are looking at this video. But we'll talk to you about what we know as of this time, which is April 3rd. The CARES Act is an interesting statute. Obviously, it's a $2+ trillion stimulus bill. And we have been very fortunate to have a provision in there that implements something that I know is very near and dear to the administrator's heart, and that was to preserve the space industrial base. In other words, he did not want to see employees of contractors being laid off, and then when this all ends and we need to get back to work, we can't find these people or they have other jobs, and so we experience further delay and more cost to get everything started up again. The new people have to learn the new systems and get accustomed to how they're going to do these things. So this was designed to try and keep the workforce, the contractor workforce, in place as much as we could. The work started prior to the passage of the CARES Act, and there is a provision in the Act at Section 3610, as you pointed out, and it is not a global kind of a thing. It's a fairly limited provision. And it basically states that it allows us to modify contracts without consideration. It also would, in my opinion, would apply to grants and cooperative agreements because it says contracts or other agreements. And it allows us to reimburse at the minimum applicable billing rates, not to exceed an average of 40 hours a week, any paid leave, including sick leave, that is provided by contractors to keep their employees in a ready state. This is all limited, though, by time. Remember, we talked about appropriations are purpose amount and time. And the time for this is the 30th of September of this year. That is the end of this fiscal year. It only will apply to contractors whose employees or subcontractors cannot perform work at a government-approved site. Now, is that just a government facility? Well, it doesn't have to be because it says a government-approved site. So if the contracting officer were to approve a different site, say a contractor's plant that's been closed, that might work. But that hasn't been decided yet. I haven't seen any real guidance on that. But the law, in my view, looks like it would allow us to do that. And it only applies to these sites that are closed or are otherwise restricted. And it only applies to employees who cannot telework because their jobs cannot be performed remotely. Now, there's another little interesting thing that's going to affect us as contract attorneys and contracting officers, and that's that it says that any amount that we provide under this section will be reduced by an amount of credit that the contractor is allowed under a previous law, Public Law 116-127. And that law sets out credits, tax credits for sick and paid leave and for paid family and medical leave. So at some point, there's going to have to be a reconciliation process, and I think that's going to be some very interesting accounting. It's not really clear to me how that's all going to work, but that's a problem that we're going to see when this all ends.
There may be several reconciliations of contractors' submissions for payment as they get more information from their employees, right? This isn't a one and done kind of deal, is it?
Oh, this is going to go on for some time, and as people come on leave, off leave, go to work, come off of work, and then go back onto leave, this is going to be an interesting issue, and contractors are going to be required to set up separate accounting codes to deal with this. We're going to deal with that in a minute because NASA has put together an advanced agreement, and one of the things it says is you got to account for all of this. Now, the agency sent out a memo later last month that basically said, we want you to assume, maintain readiness to assume full performance once this emergency is passed. And I think contractors all were scratching their head and saying, well, how do you want us to do that? You know, it costs us money to do that, and how are we going to get paid? Well, this law takes care of that. At least in one sense, it allows us to amend the contract. The law, however, appropriated money to NASA to do this. It's $60 million, but it went into the SSMS account. It did not to the accounts that typically are funded by programs and projects like science, aeronautics, technology, education, things like that. Exploration is another one.
What does SSMS generally fund? What do you typically see funded by SSMS?
Typically funds center operations, the headquarters maintenance and operations, the center maintenance and operations, people who are not program funded or paid through the SSMS account. The NESC is largely funded by the SSMS account. So there's a bunch of different kinds of things that are not necessarily programmatically related that are funded through that account. The programs are funded to do whatever it is we're going to do. Build me a Webb telescope. Build me an Orion space capsule. Explore the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. Those are other accounts that are not SSMS funded.
So those contracts are limited to the funding they've already got obligated on their contracts to fulfill this Section 10 guidance, right?
That's correct. So what we're going to have to figure out is how do we get this money over to them? Now, one way we could do that is to reprogram the money, and NASA has reprogramming authority. It's somewhat limited, but and it requires us to identify the money, and we have to send reports to the various congressional committees saying this is what we want to do and this is why we want to do it. So there is a process for reprogramming. And maybe that's the way we're going to go. I think the headquarters is still trying to work that out. Now, there is this advance agreement, and I believe it's available on LawNet. If not, we can put it up on LawNet. I've seen 3 different versions of it. And this comes back to we talked in our second episode about how do we fund contracts. We fund them through limitation, cost limitation of funds clause. And this advance agreement sets up a method by which we're going to do that. It basically says for people who are unable to work or telework because of this, you need to identify who they are and set up an account code for that. And you can put them in your paid leave status, and we will eventually work this out through a request for equitable adjustment. That's the bottom line of what this advance agreement is going to do. Is it says, okay, collect your costs and then submit an REA at the end of this time, and we'll negotiate what the amount is. I think that's going to be challenging, and there's going to be a lot of work involved, and it's going to take us probably a considerable length of time after this all ends to get that all done. The advance agreement goes on for 4 or 5 pages, and it's largely a fill-in-the-blank kind of a thing. So the contractor's going to have to fill out, who am I, what contract, what clauses. The advance agreement does allow us to use 2 other clauses that are out there that we can pay contractors to keep their workforce together. One is NASA has a weather and safety closure clause. That's only going to apply if you were working on the center. And then there is the stop work clause, and I know you and Bob Tepfer discussed that in another episode. And I thought it was an excellent discussion. If anybody who's watching this hasn't seen that, I strongly urge you to watch it. It's a really good episode. But that clause allows you to tell contractors stop work, don't do anything. But it doesn't allow them to lay their people off. It says hold your workforce together, and we're going to figure out what the problem is and get you back on. And typically that's done within 90 days. It can be extended, although it has to be done, I believe, bilaterally. So that's another clause that this advance agreement says you can cite that one if it applies. So there's 3 or 4 different ways now that you can do this. And it's, as I say, it's still a work in process. But it all ties back to appropriations law and the way we operate under the contract. We can't spend more money than we have. Well, we've been given some more money. Unfortunately, the purpose that it was appropriated for isn't necessarily the purpose that the contract is being funded for. So we're going to have to work our way through that. And we're going to do that by creating an advance agreement, which the FAR allows you to do. And we're going to fund the money through the limitation of costs and limitation of funds clauses. We're going to move the money into the contract through that way. Now, when we do the request for equitable adjustment, it could be done either that way or possibly under the changes clause. It could also be done under the disputes clause.
Yeah.
So if the contractor wants to dispute, the contracting officer has pretty broad authority under the disputes clause to work out the settlement. So there are a variety of avenues that are going to be out there, and I suspect we're going to see all of them get used at one time or another. But that's the base.
If you all work together to remember your fiscal law priorities and your FAR obligations and all of the things that are coming across in these advanced agreement templates that your job is just to seamlessly weave all this together into a wonderful piece of fabric that is maintain the space industry through this time. And you know what? We've got the best workforce who'll be able to do it. This is a very complicated issue. I know we've raised a lot of consideration without actually getting any answers. As we've often said, this is not establishing policy, but just giving you some things that you need to think about as you navigate these uncharted waters. But we got the team who can do this. This is a difficult task to pull off, but I know NASA has got the workforce that can figure out how to do it and stay within the lines, keep legal. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
All right. Any closing remarks or any other things we need to cover before we sign off from today's episode?
No, I would just urge people to look at that advance agreement and look at the law and at Section 3610 to see what it says. It is not a complete get-out-of-jail-free card. It does have some limitations. And talk to your contracting folks and talk to your program folks and make sure that they understand what those constraints are going to be. The Office of Procurement at headquarters is also putting out a lot of guidance, and some of that is now available on LawNet as well. So I urge you, stay on top of it. If you've got questions, ask them. This is not necessarily the final answer, the way things are going to go, but it at least gives you a sense of here's some things you ought to be looking at and be thinking about as you work your way through this and advise your clients.
Thank you so much for your time and insight, Michael. I've really appreciated your taking this big chunk of your day to help us get on top of all of these issues and understand what to consider. Well, until next time, see you again on Between Two FARS.